She did not arrive the way most women did. There was no trunk of fine clothes, no hat box tied with ribbon, no letter pressed against her chest like a promise she was afraid to drop. There was only a canvas bag worn soft at the handles, a coat that had been washed too many times and had gone the color of old dishwater, and a pair of hands that stayed perfectly still in her lap for the entire last hour of the journey, even when the road turned rough and every other passenger braced against the jolt. Nora Hale had learned a long time ago that stillness was a kind of armor. The wagon that brought her the last stretch of road was a supply run, not a passenger coach. She sat in the back between a crate of dry goods and a stack of fence posts that smelled of pine resin and cut earth. The driver, a man with no interest in conversation, had asked her once where she was headed and then forgot about her entirely when she answered. That was fine. She was used to being forgotten. What she was not used to, what she was still learning the shape of, was choosing to go somewhere instead of being driven out. The town appeared slowly, the way all frontier towns did, as if it hadn't quite decided whether to exist yet. A water tower first, then the dark line of rooftops against the pale sky, then the sounds of it. A hammer somewhere, a horse, the particular creak of a building that had been standing in wind for too many years. Nora looked at all of it the way she looked at most things now, carefully, without expression, taking inventory. She was 34 years old. She had been a wife. She had been a nurse. She had been, for the past 14 months, the woman people whispered about when they thought she couldn't hear. She had learned to hear everything. The wagon stopped at the edge of the main street, and the driver jerked his head to indicate this was as far as he went. Nora climbed down without help, her boots meeting the packed dirt with a sound that was quieter than she expected, as if the town were holding its breath. She stood with her bag at her feet and looked at the place that was supposed to be her beginning, and felt nothing yet. That was all right. She had stopped expecting feelings to arrive on schedule. A man was leaning against the hitching post near the general store, watching her with the patient expression of someone who had been waiting a while and was accustomed to it. He was older, somewhere past 60, with a face that had been weathered into something like honesty. He wore the clothes of a working ranch hand, heavy canvas, worn leather, dust in the creases of everything. He straightened when she looked at him and crossed the street without hurrying. "Mrs. Hale," he said. It was not a question. That's right. He looked at her bag, then at her, and seemed to come to some conclusion. "Name's Obadiah Morrow. Everyone calls me Bade." He reached for her bag and she let him take it, which surprised her a little. She was not accustomed to letting people carry things for her. "Mr. Voss sent me to bring you out to the ranch." She noticed that he had not said Mr. Voss sent his apologies for not coming himself. She noticed that he had not manufactured any warmth on his employer's behalf. She filed both observations away. "He wanted me to tell you something," Bade said, loading her bag into the back of a ranch wagon that was just as utilitarian as the one she had arrived in. He paused in a way that suggested he was choosing his words, not because he was uncertain of them, but because he wanted to deliver them accurately. He said, "Don't expect a warm welcome." Nora settled onto the wagon seat. "All right." Bade climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. He glanced at her sideways, and she saw something in his expression shift. Not sympathy exactly, but a recalibration. "I'm saying," he added, "don't let that fool you." She did not ask what he meant. She thought she would understand it when she needed to. The land opened up as they left the town behind, and Nora understood immediately why a man might stay here, even when staying was hard. The sky was enormous. That was the first thing. The sheer quantity of sky, pale blue deepening toward the horizon, stretching in every direction without apology. The grass moved in long silver waves when the wind came through, and the distance between things had a particular quality to it, not emptiness exactly, but space, room to be something other than what you had been. She had needed that. Room. The coal ranch, which still carried that name on the gate, though the man who ran it now was a Voss, not a Cole, the previous owner having been Garrett's father-in-law who had left it to his daughter, who had left it to her husband when she died, sat at the end of a road that curved through a stand of cottonwoods before opening into a yard of hard-packed earth. The main house was not grand. It had been built to last, not to impress, and the years had settled into it the way years settle into anything honest, with weight, with a certain quiet dignity, with repairs visible here and there that told you someone still cared enough to keep it standing. Bade stopped the wagon and climbed down. Nora was already stepping off the other side before he came around, and he nodded once as if that told him something useful. The man standing at the far edge of the yard, near the fence line that separated the house from the working area of the ranch, had his back to them. He was looking at something in the distance. Or nothing. It was hard to say. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual work rather than the intention of it, and he wore his coat like he'd forgotten he had it on. He did not turn around immediately. He waited one breath, two, and then he turned. Garrett Voss was 38 years old, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped expecting anyone to notice. His face was angular and weathered, not unpleasant, but guarded in the deep, specific way of someone who has learned that openness leads to loss. His eyes were the color of creek water in late autumn, gray-green, difficult to read, taking her in with the same careful inventory she had been doing of everything since she stepped off that supply wagon. He crossed the yard toward her and stopped at a reasonable distance. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm, not performative. Her grip was firm back, and something moved through his expression. There and gone, too quick to name. "Mrs. Hale," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Mr. Voss." A silence sat between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but honest. Neither of them pretended this was a joyful occasion. Neither of them reached for pleasantries they didn't mean. "Bade will show you your room," he said. "Supper's at 6. The kitchen is yours to manage as you see fit." He paused. "The room has a lock. The key is on the inside." He said it plainly, without emphasis, as a fact being communicated rather than a virtue being advertised. But she heard it for what it was, a man telling her, in the only language he apparently had available, that she would be safe here. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and walked back toward the fence line and whatever he had been looking at before. She watched him go for just a moment, then followed Bade into the house. The room was at the back of the house, off the hallway that ran past the kitchen. It was not large. The floorboards were uneven but clean. The window looked out toward the eastern pasture, and the curtains were new. She could tell by the way they hung, without the soft drape of fabric that had been washed many times. Someone had put up new curtains recently. There was a small table beside the bed. On it sat a blue ceramic pitcher and basin, a folded towel, and a tin cup. And in the center of the table, in a plain glass jar, was a small arrangement of dried herbs. Lavender, she thought. And something else. A medicinal plant she recognized from her nursing years, the kind used for inflammation and mild pain. Nora set her bag down and stood looking at the herbs for a long moment. They were not decorative. Anyone who knew plants would recognize that immediately. These were working herbs, the kind kept in a medical bag or a kitchen drawer, not arranged in a vase for prettiness. Someone had put them here knowing she would know what they were, knowing she had been a nurse. She did not think Garrett Voss had done it consciously. She did not think he had stood in front of the table and thought, "She will understand this." But she thought, with a quiet certainty that she had learned to trust, that some part of him had wanted to say something he didn't know how to say out loud, and so he had said it in the only other language available, in lavender and dried herbs and new curtains, and a key left on the inside of a lock. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water running over stone. A horse made some comment in the distance that no one answered. The light through the new curtains was the particular gold of late afternoon, and for one moment, just one, Nora Hale allowed herself to feel something other than careful. Then she stood, unpacked her bag with the efficiency of long practice, and set her worn medical notebook, its brown cover soft with handling, on the corner of the table beside the herbs. She looked at both things sitting there together, the notebook and the lavender. Two languages, maybe not so different after all. She had been there less than 2 hours when Reverend Silas Crane came to call. She was in the kitchen, learning where things were kept, which drawer held the knives, where the flour was stored, whether there was a system to the shelves, or whether it was the accumulated logic of a man who lived alone and cooked without much interest in the subject. She had just found a cast-iron skillet that had been seasoned over what appeared to be decades, and was thinking that whoever had maintained it had cared about doing things properly, when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard and then voices. Through the kitchen window she could see the yard. A man had dismounted near the gate, not a working man. She could see that from the cut of his coat and the horse he rode, which was a good horse, better than you needed for utility, the kind of horse that was partly about arriving. He was perhaps 60, lean in the face, with white hair and the upright posture of a man accustomed to standing at the front of rooms. He was speaking to Garrett, who had emerged from somewhere and stood with his arms at his sides in a posture that was not rude, but was not welcoming either. Nora could not hear the words. She watched the shapes of the conversation, the visitor's expansive gestures, Garrett's stillness, the way Garrett did not move toward the man and did not move away, simply held his ground with the patient solidity of someone who had heard this particular kind of speech before. Then the visitor looked toward the house, toward the kitchen window. He could not have seen her clearly. The angle was wrong. The light was against her. But his gaze stopped at that window and stayed there for a beat longer than was natural, and something passed across his face that was too quick and too controlled for her to name. Recognition, she thought, or the cousin of it. He said something to Garrett. Garrett replied in a way that ended the conversation. The visitor smiled, the practiced smile of a man who had learned to keep his expressions ahead of his intentions, and remounted his horse with the ease of someone who knew he was being watched and didn't mind. He rode out of the yard without looking back. Garrett came into the kitchen a few minutes later. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot she had noticed was kept ready on the back burner, an ingrained habit. He drank it standing up, looking at nothing particular, Who was that? Nora asked. She kept her voice level. She was good at level. Garrett looked at her over the rim of the cup. Reverend Silas Crane. A pause. He runs the church in town, sits on the local council, has opinions about most things. He was looking at the house. He was looking at you. The directness of it surprised her. She waited. Garrett set the cup down on the counter. His jaw was set in a way that was not anger, but was adjacent to it, more like the face of a man who has been patient for a long time and is measuring how much patience he has left. Crane has made 3 offers on this ranch in the past 4 years, he said. I've turned him down 3 times. He believes he's a man who gets what he wants. He hasn't decided yet whether I understand that. Nora absorbed this. And me? She asked. Why was he looking at me? Garrett's eyes met hers, steady, gray-green, without evasion. Because you're new, and because anything new on this ranch is something he needs to account for. Before she could respond, he picked up his cup and walked back out. The screen door closed behind him with a sound that was not quite a slam but had made its point. Nora stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the silence he had left behind. Then she turned back to the shelves and continued learning where things were kept. Bade found her after supper when she was washing the dishes in the last of the evening light. He came into the kitchen without announcing himself, in the way of someone who had been moving through this house for so long that the habit of knocking had never taken hold. He poured himself the last of the coffee, cold now, and leaned against the counter and drank it without complaining. Crane's been on this land before, he said, without preamble. Long time ago, when it belonged to Mr. Voss's father-in-law. Made an offer then, too. Got turned down then, too. Nora dried a plate and set it on the shelf. He doesn't seem like a man who takes no for an answer. He's not. Bade turned the cup in his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much to say and settling on more rather than less. He went after the Fenwick family about 5 years back. Good people. Had a piece of land east of here, ran cattle on it. Crane wanted it for development, or so he said. Started spreading talk about them in town. Nothing you could pin down exactly, just talk. The kind that makes people cross the street. He paused. By spring, the Fenwicks had sold and moved on. Crane got the land at a quarter of what it was worth. Nora set down the cloth she was drying with. And no one stopped him. Who was going to stop him? Bade said it without bitterness, as a plain fact. He's the Reverend. He's on the council. He's been here 30 years, and he knows where every family in that town keeps their secrets. He looked at her steadily. He doesn't fight fair, Mrs. Hale. I'm telling you this because you're here now. And what happens to this ranch happens to everyone on it. And because you seem like a woman who does better with the truth than without it. She met his eyes. Thank you, Bade. He nodded, set his cup in the basin, and went back out into the evening. Nora stood alone in the kitchen. Through the window, the last light was going out of the sky in long bands of rose and gray, and the silhouette of the cottonwoods stood very dark against it. She could hear, distantly, the sound of Garrett moving in the barn, the particular rhythm of work done at the end of a day, methodical, unhurried, the sound of a man who had nowhere else to be. She thought about Crane's face at the window, the way his gaze had stopped there, the something that had moved through his expression. She thought about pattern. She had been a nurse long enough to know that when something happened once, it could be circumstance, twice, coincidence, 3 times. 3 times was how something declared its nature. She was still thinking about it when she went back to her room, lit the small lamp on the table, and sat down on the edge of the bed. The herbs in the jar cast a faint shadow on the wall. Her medical notebook sat where she had left it, the brown cover warm in the lamplight. She reached under the mattress where she had tucked it, an old habit, the kind you develop when you have lived somewhere that taught you to be careful, and drew out a folded piece of paper. She had found it earlier, slipped under her door sometime in the late afternoon, while she was still in the kitchen learning the geography of the shelves. She had picked it up, read it once, and put it away without changing her expression, because she had been in the kitchen and Garrett had been nearby, and she had needed time to think before she decided what any of it meant. She unfolded it now. The handwriting was small and careful, neither masculine nor feminine in any obvious way. The letters formed with the precision of someone who wrote rarely and wanted to be understood. He doesn't know what they said about you. The town will tell him soon enough. No signature, no indication of how it had arrived, who had placed it, or whether the person who had written it meant it as a warning or a threat or something in between. She read it a second time, and then a third. And then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the lamp flame for a long time. Someone in this town already knew who she was, what had happened in the place she had come from, what they had said about her after her husband died in the bed she had tried and failed to save him from. Someone knew, and someone had thought she should know they knew. Before the town got there first. The question was whether that someone was trying to protect her, or whether they were simply letting her understand the dimensions of a trap that had already been set. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods again. The horse made its comment again. Somewhere in the barn, Garrett Voss was still moving through the last work of the day, steady and unhurried. A man who did not yet know what was coming. Nora set the note on the table beside her medical notebook and the jar of dried herbs. 3 things in a row. She looked at all of them for a moment, then reached over and turned down the lamp. In the dark, she did not sleep right away. She lay on her back and listened to the sounds of a ranch settling into night, the creak of the house, the distant horses, the wind, and thought about what it meant to begin somewhere, whether beginning was something you chose or something that happened to you, whether there was a difference. She had told herself on the long journey here that she was coming because she had nowhere else to go. That was true as far as it went, but somewhere in the last few hours, in a kitchen with new curtains and dried herbs placed by a hand that didn't know how to ask for what it meant to offer, in a conversation with an old man who had chosen to tell her the truth, in the sight of a man standing alone at a fence line, looking at a distance he had been looking at for a long time. She had felt something she had not expected to feel this soon. Not hope exactly. Hope was too large a word for what it was. More like the first faint recognition of a door that had not, after all, been locked from the outside, only from the inside, and that the key, it turned out, had been on her side all along. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. The ranch breathed around her in the dark. Nora Hale stayed still and let herself be somewhere for the first time in a long time. The first week passed the way early things do, carefully, with a great deal of attention paid to small distances. Nora learned the kitchen the way she had once learned a ward, systematically, without sentiment, until she knew where everything was in the dark. She learned that Garrett took his coffee black and his breakfast early, before the light was fully up, and that he did not linger over either. She learned that Bade ate whatever was put in front of him with the uncomplicated gratitude of a man who had spent decades not taking meals for granted. She learned that the ranch hand who came in for the midday meal, a young man named Percy Follett, 19 years old, and still in the process of assembling his face into something a person could read, was terrified of her in the specific way that young men are terrified of women who do not perform softness for their benefit. She did not perform softness. She was not unkind. There was a difference, and she had stopped explaining it. Garrett moved through the house the way water moves around stone, acknowledging the obstacle without making it personal. He said what needed to be said. He did not say what didn't. In the mornings, before she came into the kitchen, the coffee was already on the back of the stove, kept warm at a temperature that suggested someone had thought about the fact that she might not be an early riser and had decided to account for it without being asked. She noticed this on the second morning. On the third, she noticed that the firewood beside the kitchen stove had been restocked sometime in the night, which meant he had done it before dawn when she was still asleep, which meant he had done it quietly so as not to wake her, which meant he had thought about it at all. She did not say anything about the firewood, neither did he. They ate their evening meals at the same table in a silence that was not hostile but was not yet comfortable. It was the silence of two people who have not yet found the frequency at which they can speak to each other without it costing something. Nora had known silences like this before. She had learned that forcing words into them was usually worse than leaving them alone. On the fourth evening, she set a second cup of coffee on the table after supper, beside his, without explanation. He looked at it. He looked at her. He drank it without comment. But he stayed at the table 10 minutes longer than he had the 3 evenings before. She counted those 10 minutes as something. It was the horse that changed things, or began to change them. On the 5th morning, she came out of the house to find a commotion near the small paddock at the side of the barn. Bade crouching beside a young roan horse that had gotten a foreleg tangled in old wire at the fence line and was now down on its side, breathing fast and shallow, the kind of breathing that was more fear than pain, but would become pain soon if the fear wasn't addressed first. Percy was hovering uselessly near the gate. Bade was talking to the horse in a low, steady voice, but his hands were uncertain. He knew cattle, she had already gathered that. But this was a young horse in panic, and a different kind of knowing was required. Nora crossed the yard without running, because running would have made the horse worse. She crouched at the animal's neck on the far side from the wound, where the horse could see her, and she put one hand flat against the animal's jaw and held it there and said nothing. Just held it. The horse's eye rolled toward her, wild and showing white at the rim, and she kept her hand there, and kept her breathing slow and deliberate, and after a moment, not a short moment, but a real one, long enough that Percy shifted his weight twice, and Bade looked at her with something recalibrating in his expression. The horse's breathing began to change, not calm, not yet, but less frantic. The edge came off it. "The wire," she said to Bade, keeping her voice level. "Can you free it without pulling?" He could, and he did, carefully, while she maintained the pressure of her hand against the horse's jaw and kept her eyes on the animal's eye and her breathing steady as a metronome. When the wire came loose, the horse flinched and tried to rise, and she rose with it, keeping her hand in contact through the movement, and by the time the animal was on its feet and trembling in the thin morning light, the worst was over. She examined the leg. The wire had cut shallowly. It would need cleaning and a few days of watching, but it would heal without intervention beyond what she could provide from the supply cabinet she had already inventoried in the barn on her second day, because inventorying things was simply what she did when she arrived somewhere. She cleaned it. She bandaged it with clean strips of cloth she had prepared the previous week from a flour sack that had gone to holes, because she had noticed the supply of proper bandaging material was low and had done something about it quietly and without making it into an announcement. When she straightened and turned, Garrett was standing at the paddock fence. She did not know how long he had been there. His arms were rested on the top rail, and his expression was the expression he usually wore, which was to say that it was carefully neutral, but there was something underneath the neutrality that she was beginning to learn to look for. A quality of attention, a particular stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, as if something had caught hold of him and he was deciding what to do about it. He said nothing. She said nothing. She gathered the remaining cloth strips and walked back toward the house, and she felt his gaze on her back for the length of the yard, steady and thoughtful. The way you look at something that has just revealed itself to be different from what you assumed. That afternoon, without any discussion she was party to, a fresh supply of proper bandaging cloth appeared on the shelf in the barn beside the medicines. It had been folded neatly. She did not ask where it had come from. She simply noted that it was there and moved on. The trouble in town announced itself quietly, the way trouble usually did. She had gone in for supplies on a Tuesday, driving the smaller wagon herself because Bade had work that couldn't be left, and she had made clear without drama that she was capable of managing a wagon on a straightforward road. The general store was run by a man named Aldrich Pell, who had the look of someone who had been tallying small grievances for so long they had become the primary architecture of his face. He had been pleasant enough on her first visit the previous week when Garrett had come with her. He was not pleasant now. It was not overt. She had spent enough time around people to understand that the worst kind of hostility rarely was. It was in the pace of his service, which slowed in a way that could not quite be called deliberate. It was in the way he found reasons to turn away, to consult the back shelves, to engage in a lengthy conversation with another customer that seemed to have no real urgency behind it. It was in the faces of the two women near the dry goods section who had been talking when she came in and went quiet in the way you go quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because what you have to say is about the person who just walked through the door. Nora took a measuring breath and waited. She was not unfamiliar with this. She had been waiting out rooms like this one for over a year. When Pell finally came to help her, he informed her, in a tone carefully constructed to avoid the word refusing, that several of the items on her list were unfortunately, a word he deployed with surgical precision, not in stock at present. She looked at the shelves. The items were on the shelves. She could see them from where she stood. She could have said that. She chose not to, because she was on her own in a town she did not yet know, and making enemies in a general store on a Tuesday was not a strategic use of the limited capital she had available. She bought what she was permitted to buy, said thank you in a voice that gave nothing away, and drove back to the ranch. She did not tell Garrett. She put the supplies away, started supper, and spent the evening being precisely as composed as she had been every other evening, which is to say, very. But she lay awake that night longer than usual, listening to the house settle and thinking about the midsection of a conversation she had not been meant to hear. A few words, only, caught as she passed the open door of the feed store on her way back to the wagon. Two men she didn't know, voices low, one of them saying something about the woman Voss had brought in, and the other saying a phrase she had heard before in a different context. Something about a husband. Something about what kind of woman. She knew what kind of woman. She had been being that kind of woman for 14 months. The kind whose husband died. The kind who had been there when it happened. The kind that people who had not been there, who had not held a dying man's hand through 4 impossible hours and done everything that could be done, and some things that probably couldn't, nonetheless felt qualified to have opinions about. She was very still in the dark, and she did not let herself feel it all the way, because feeling it all the way had a cost she could not always afford. Garrett knew before she told him. She was not certain how, but she was certain of the fact of it. She could see it in the set of his shoulders the next morning at breakfast, a quality of having made a decision that had not been visible the morning before. He came to find her mid-morning when she was in the kitchen making bread, because bread was one of the things she did when she needed to think with her hands instead of her head. "I need to go into town for a part for the north pump," he said. "Come with me." It was not phrased as a question. It was also not phrased as a command. It occupied the precise middle ground between them, which she was beginning to recognize as his particular dialect. She did not ask why. She wiped her hands on her apron and went. He drove. They did not speak much on the road into town. A few words about the pump, about the north pasture, about Percy's ongoing difficulties with the concept of mending fence in a straight line. Small things. The kind of conversation that is not really about itself. When they walked into Pell's general store, Garrett did not announce anything or make a speech. He simply stood beside her at the counter and looked at Aldrich Pell with the particular quality of attention that Nora was beginning to understand was one of Garrett Voss's more effective tools. It was not threatening. It was not angry. It was simply the gaze of a man who was going to stand exactly where he was standing for as long as it took, with no apparent discomfort and no apparent schedule, and who had clearly done this before. Pell served her, efficiently, every item on her list. He did not meet her eyes, but he did not make her wait. Outside, loading the supplies into the wagon, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." Garrett set a sack of flour in the wagon bed and straightened. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that gave away less than most people's did, but were not, she was learning, actually empty. "I know," he said. He climbed up to the driver's seat. She climbed up the other side. They drove home with the sun behind them and the road ahead pale and straight. And she spent most of it thinking about the weight of a thing that could be said in 2 letters and mean something that large. It was Bade who told her about the biscuit tin. He came to find her one afternoon when she was in the small room off the kitchen that served as a combination larder and storage space, reorganizing the shelves in a way that made more practical sense than the current arrangement, which appeared to have been arrived at through a series of individual decisions made with no reference to each other over a period of several years. Bade leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment, and she could tell by the particular quality of his leaning that he had come to say something specific and was finding his way to it. "There's a tin box," he said, "in the bottom of the chest in the corner of the main room, under the extra blankets." She paused what she was doing and looked at him. "I'm not telling you to go through it," he said carefully. "I'm telling you it exists, and that it has some papers in it, and some drawings. Ellen's, that was Mr. Voss's wife, Ellen Voss. Before she married, she was a Cole, which is why the ranch still has that name on the gate." He paused. "She drew things, buildings mostly. She had ideas about the ranch. improvements she wanted to make someday. There's a design for a new stable in there. She made notes all through the margins. Garrett found it after she died and put it in the tin and put the tin under the blankets. He hasn't looked at it since. Why are you telling me this? Bade was quiet for a moment. He had the kind of face that was not easy to read but rewarded patience. Because last week I watched you sit with a frightened horse for 20 minutes without moving or making a sound until it decided you weren't a threat. And I've watched you be in this house for going on 2 weeks without pushing anything or asking for anything or making any of it harder than it needs to be. He looked at her steadily. And I thought, if anyone is going to understand what's in that tin, it's probably you. He pushed off the doorframe and went back out to whatever work awaited him, and she stood among the reorganized shelves for a long time, listening to the ordinary sounds of the ranch, thinking. She found it that evening. She did not take anything out of it. She only lifted the lid and looked, and there it was, folded carefully, a large sheet of heavy paper, a drawing in pencil that showed a stable in careful cross-section, with notes written in the margins in a hand that was small and precise and had clearly belonged to a woman who thought carefully about things. The measurements were exact. The notations were practical. Whoever Ellen Voss had been, she had been a woman who made plans with the intention of carrying them out. Nora looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she closed the tin and put it back under the blankets. She went to her room and sat at her table and opened her own notebook. Not the medical one, a second one, smaller, that she used for other things. And she began, quietly and without any particular agenda that she could have named, to sketch. She was not an artist, but she had spent years reading medical diagrams and understanding spatial relationships and translating two-dimensional drawings into three-dimensional reality, and the lines came easily enough. And the notes she added in the margins were informed by 2 weeks of observation. What the ranch actually needed, where the light fell in the mornings, how many horses Garrett currently ran versus how many the new pasture grass might support. She did not know why she was doing it. She told herself it was something to do with her hands. She told herself it was purely practical. She filled 4 pages before she put the notebook down, and by then the lamp had burned low, and the ranch was deep in the sounds of night. Reverend Crane came back on a Thursday, and this time he came officially. He arrived with a document, paper folded into thirds and sealed with something that wanted to look important, which he presented to Garrett at the front gate with the ceremony of a man who has rehearsed the delivery. Nora watched from the kitchen window, hands still in the bread dough she was working. And she watched Garrett's face as he read whatever was on that paper, and she saw something move through his expression that she had not seen on it before. Not fear. Garrett Voss did not appear to have a straightforward relationship with fear, but something careful, something that was calculating distance and weight the way you do when the ground has just demonstrated it is less solid than you assumed. He came inside when Crane had ridden away. He set the paper on the kitchen table with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. Nora cleaned her hands and came to look at it without being asked. It was, as near as she could understand the language of it, a formal request, addressed to those on the local council who handled such matters, for a public hearing into the conduct of one Nora Hale, late of a town she had come from, in connection with the death of her husband. It cited a witness, unnamed in the document, who was prepared to attest to gross negligence. It used the word character 3 times, and the word community 4 times, and it was signed by Silas Crane in a signature that had the look of a man who had signed things like this before. Nora read it twice. She was aware of Garrett standing on the other side of the table, watching her read it. "He found someone," she said. Her voice came out level. She was good at level. "It says so." She set the paper back on the table and looked at it for another moment. She was thinking about Bade's account of the Fenwick family, about pattern, about what the third time declared. She was thinking about the note under her door on the first night. "He doesn't know what they said about you. The town will tell him soon enough." Someone had known this was coming. Someone had tried to warn her. "The hearing," she said. "If it happens, they'll bring people from town. It becomes public." "Yes?" She looked up at him. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention, the stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. He had read the document too. He knew what was in it. He had not, she noticed, asked her whether any of it was true. He had put it on the table and waited for her to read it, and was now simply here, on the other side of the table, present in whatever this was. "Mr. Voss," she said carefully, "this will cause problems for you. Whatever he intends with it, it will cause problems. I expect it will. People will talk. They've been talking." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back, and then he said something that she would think about later, lying in the dark after the lamp was out, turning it over and over in the way you turn over something small and dense that turns out to weigh more than it looks. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "when you treated that horse last week, you knew what you were doing." It was not a question, and she did not answer it like one. "When you reorganized the supply shelf in the barn," he continued, "you did it without being asked, and you did it correctly." Correctly meaning the way someone with medical knowledge would do it, not the way a housekeeper would do it. A pause. "You've been here 2 weeks, and I have not once had to wonder whether something would be done or whether it would be done well." She waited. "I don't know what happened the night your husband died," he said. "I don't know the particulars, and I'm not asking you for them now." He paused again. In the pause she heard something that was effortful, not because he was lying, but because he was telling the truth, and it cost him something to do it directly. "But I know what I've seen in 2 weeks, and what I've seen is someone who knows how to take care of things. People." He glanced at the paper on the table. "That document doesn't change what I've seen." Nora stood very still. She was aware of the bread dough on the counter, which needed to be punched down. She was aware of the afternoon light coming through the window, which had turned the color of weak tea. She was aware that no one had said anything like that to her in over a year. She said, "Thank you." It came out quieter than she intended. He nodded once, picked up the document, and carried it with him out of the kitchen, and she stood for a moment in the space where the conversation had been, feeling the unfamiliar weight of having been believed by someone, and finding she did not entirely know what to do with it. She punched the bread dough down. She shaped it and covered it and set it to rise. She went about the rest of the afternoon with the ordinary efficiency that was her primary mode of being in the world, and she did not let herself think too much about what had just happened in the kitchen. But that evening, after supper, she set his coffee cup on the table beside hers, not across from hers, beside it. And when he looked at that small change in the arrangement, she looked back at him, and something that had been very carefully held in both of them shifted just slightly, the way a door shifts when someone finally stops leaning against it from the other side. They drank their coffee in silence, but it was a different silence now. It had changed its quality. It had become the silence of two people who were no longer quite strangers, and who were both pretending, for the time being, not to have noticed. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote said something to the dark that no one answered, and the ranch settled into night around them the way it always did, steadily, without drama, with the patient certainty of something that had been here before either of them arrived and intended to be here long after. Nora Hale sat at the kitchen table and drank her coffee, and was, for the length of that quiet evening, exactly where she was. Not where she had been. Not yet. Where she was going. Just here, for now. That, she thought, was more than she'd had in a long time. He found her in the barn at the end of a long day, not working, which was unusual enough to make him stop in the doorway. She was sitting on the low bench, along the near wall, the one Bade used when he was repairing tack, and she had her medical notebook open on her knee, but she was not writing in it. She was looking at the roan horse in the third stall, the one she had treated 2 weeks ago, who was healed now and had developed, in the way of horses who have been handled gently through pain, a particular opinion about Nora specifically, turning his head toward the sound of her voice with an attention he did not give to anyone else. She was looking at the horse, and the horse was looking at her, and neither of them was doing anything in particular, just existing in the same space with a comfort that had been earned rather than assumed. Garrett stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. When she turned, she did not startle. She simply looked at him with those steady gray eyes that had been her most consistent feature since the day she arrived. Watchful, clear, giving away less than they took in. He came into the barn and sat down on the other end of the bench. Not close. The appropriate distance of two people who were still learning the geography of each other. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the horse too. And they were quiet together in the way that had become, over the past weeks, less effortful. "Tell me what actually happened," he said. "That night. Not what the document says. Not what Crane's witness is going to say." He paused. "What you remember." She was still for a moment. The horse moved slightly in his stall, a shift of weight, the soft percussion of a hoof on packed earth. Then she began. She told it the way she had never told it before. Not the version she had given to the people who came to ask questions afterward, which had been accurate but abbreviated, stripped of everything that would have made them feel the weight of it. Not the version she had told herself in the dark of too many nights, which had been weighted in the opposite direction, laden with every moment she had questioned and every decision she had second-guessed, until the story became more about her failure than about what had actually occurred. She told it the way it had actually been. Her husband had been thrown from a horse in the late afternoon, a bad fall, the kind that announces itself in the particular way he landed. By the time she reached him, he was conscious, but his breathing was wrong, and she knew, with the specific knowledge that nursing gives a person, the kind you carry in your hands as much as your head, that there was internal damage and that time was the variable that mattered most. She sent the farmhand for a doctor. She made her husband as stable as she could with what she had. She stayed with him and worked and talked to him and worked some more. And the doctor did not come. Could not come, as it turned out. Because there was flooding on the road. Because weather does not consult anyone's timeline. And she was alone with him for 4 hours, and she made every decision that could be made, and she made them correctly, and he died anyway. Because sometimes people die anyway. Because the body has its own priorities, and they do not always align with what the people who love them need. Because medicine, even good medicine, even medicine applied with skill and without hesitation, is not a promise. She had saved 2 other people that winter, a child with a fever that had gone septic, an elderly man who had fallen and whose wound had infected. Both of them had lived because she had been there and had known what to do. The town did not count those. The town counted what it counted and left the rest out of the ledger. When she finished, the barn was very quiet. The horse had settled. Outside, the light had gone the deep amber of late afternoon, and the sounds of the ranch were distant and muffled, as if the world had stepped back to give them room. Garrett was looking at his hands. He had not moved while she talked. She watched him now, the way she watched most things, carefully, reading what was available. He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she had misjudged the invitation to speak, if what he had offered was less than she had taken it for. But then he drew a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not softer exactly, but less defended. The way stone sounds different when something has been lifted off it. Ellen went into labor in a snowstorm, he said. The worst one in years. I sent Percy's father for the doctor. Percy was a boy then. His father worked this ranch the same way he does now. And the roads were already bad and getting worse. He paused. The doctor didn't come. Couldn't come. Nora held very still. There was a woman in town who served as midwife, he said, but she was on the other side of the flooding, the same as the doctor, and by the time we understood that no one was coming, it was already... He stopped, started again. There was nothing anyone could have done. That's what they told me afterward. The doctor said it when he finally got through, 2 days later. He said the outcome would have been the same regardless. That some things... He stopped again, and this time he didn't start again immediately. Nora waited. She was good at waiting. I've never believed him, Garrett said finally. It came out low and even, the way you say a thing you have said only to yourself for a very long time. I've told myself I believe him. I've gotten up every morning and worked this ranch and done every practical thing a man can do. And I've told myself that what happened was not a consequence of anything I failed to do. He looked up then, and his eyes met hers, and she saw in them the specific exhaustion of a man who has been arguing with himself for years. But I keep thinking, if there had been someone who knew what to do, someone like you, if there had been someone with those hands and that knowledge and that... He paused on the word, seemed to weigh it. That steadiness, that willingness to stay in the middle of something terrible and just keep working. He stopped. The silence held everything he hadn't said, which was more than what he had. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You would have lost her anyway." He looked at her. "Not because I'm saying the doctor was right," she said. "I don't know the particulars, and I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because in my experience..." She paused, finding the right words, the honest ones. "The cases that end the way yours ended, they announce themselves. There's a quality to them that you learn to recognize. And when you recognize it, you understand that the question stops being whether and starts being only when and how much can we do in the time that's left." She held his gaze. That's not a failure of medicine. That's the limit of what medicine is. The barn was very quiet. I've never told anyone that, she said, about my husband, the whole of it. I know. He said it simply, as a fact, which was more than if he had said he was grateful. They sat for a while longer in the gathering quiet of the late afternoon, and the horse regarded them both with his large, patient eye. And outside the wind moved through the grass in long silver waves, and something between them that had been held at a careful distance for weeks settled, very slowly, into a closer range. Crane's petition had gathered names. This was the information Bade brought in from town on a market day, his expression carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering news he wishes were different. He laid it out plainly, the way he laid out everything. Crane had been visiting households, presenting the petition as a matter of community welfare, framing it in the language of protection and propriety. Many of the signatures, Bade said, had been given not from conviction, but from something closer to gravity. The pull of a man who had occupied the center of the town's social architecture for 30 years, whose approval had weight, and whose disapproval had consequence. Nora listened without interrupting. When Bade was done, she thanked him, and he went back out, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment, thinking about the specific geometry of what Crane was doing. He was not, she had come to understand, primarily interested in her. She was a tool. The goal was the ranch. The method was to make Garrett's position untenable, to surround him with enough social pressure that holding his ground became more costly than selling. She was the pressure. Her past was the mechanism. Crane had found the most efficient available lever, and he was applying it with the patience of a man who had done this before and knew how long it took to work. What she had not fully reckoned with until now was that the lever was her life, her husband's death, the worst night she had ever lived through, with all its attendant grief and helplessness, and the specific horror of doing everything right and having it not be enough. Crane had taken that and filed it into a shape that fit his purpose, and he was carrying it through town like a weapon, and the people signing his petition mostly did not know and would not think to ask what it felt like to be the thing being carried. She was not angry. She had been angry once in the early months after her husband died, when the talk first started and she had still believed that facts were sufficient to correct misunderstanding. She had moved through anger into something quieter and more durable, a kind of clear-eyed recognition of what people were capable of when they were frightened or small or simply not paying attention. It was not forgiveness, and it was not acceptance. It was more like the particular calm of someone who has been in difficult weather before and knows how to move through it. What she had not expected was that moving through it would be different when she was not alone. She found it on a Tuesday evening when she went to the main room for an extra candle and noticed the chest in the corner, and then noticed, because she noticed things, that the latch was not fully closed in the way it had been every other time she had walked past it. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she opened it and moved the folded blankets, and found, where Bade had told her it would be, the biscuit tin. She had not intended to open it. She had told herself, when Bade first mentioned it, that she would leave it alone, that it was not her place, that some things were private in a way that should be respected regardless of what good reasons might be assembled for looking. But the latch had been open, which meant Garrett had been in the chest recently, which meant the tin had been disturbed, perhaps looked at, perhaps opened, perhaps closed again, and replaced with the latch not quite catching. She lifted the lid of the tin. The drawing was there as Bade had described, folded carefully, the heavy paper soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded, the pencil lines faded in places but clear enough to read. She opened it on the floor beside the chest, in the lamplight, and looked at it for a long time. Ellen Voss had been a precise thinker. The stable she had designed was practical and well-proportioned, with clear attention to the needs of working animals rather than the aesthetics of the thing. Good drainage, thoughtful placement of the stalls for airflow, wide enough doors for the movement of horses under stress. Small details everywhere that said, "I have thought about this from the inside out, not from the outside in." The notes in the margins were written in the same small, careful hand as the measurements, and they were not decorative. They were working notes, the kind you write when you are planning to actually do a thing rather than simply to have imagined it. Nora sat on the floor with the drawing on her knees for a long time. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the tin, and put the tin back in the chest, and closed the latch properly. She went to her room. She opened her second notebook, the smaller one, and she continued the sketches she had begun the previous week. She worked for 2 hours, adding to the margins, correcting proportions, incorporating what Ellen's drawing had told her about what the ranch actually needed, what it had been heading toward in the mind of a woman who had understood it from the inside. She was not replacing anything. She understood that clearly. She was not putting herself in a space that belonged to someone else or trying to overwrite what had been. She was only continuing, following a line of thought that had been interrupted and setting it back in motion because it was a good thought and it deserved to be followed. When she put the notebook down, the lamp had burned low and the house was completely silent, and she sat for a moment in the particular quiet of having done something that felt right, in a way she had not expected. She left the notebook on the kitchen table the next morning, not open, closed, set to one side, in the space where it might be noticed or might not be. She went out to tend the kitchen garden, which was coming in well despite the late start, and she stayed out there through the middle of the morning, which was enough time. When she came back in, the notebook had not been moved. But Garrett was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, which was unusual. He rarely sat in the kitchen during working hours. And he was looking at the notebook, not touching it, in the way of a man looking at something he has decided not to open without permission. She came in and washed her hands at the basin and dried them. Then she picked up the notebook and opened it to the first page of the stable sketches and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him, not beside him, because this was not a beside moment. This was a facing moment, one that required being able to see each other. He turned the pages slowly. He read the margin notes. She could see him reading them, the slight movement of his eyes tracking the small, careful handwriting. He reached the 4th page and stopped, and she knew that was where she had noted in the margin something about the eastern light and which stall orientation would catch it best in the mornings. A detail that was either practical or sentimental or both, and that she had written because it was what Ellen's notes had seemed to be building toward before they stopped. He closed the notebook. He set it on the table between them. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was neither guarded nor neutral, but simply open. Not all the way, not without reservation, but open in the way that a window is open, where the air can move. "Bade told you about the tin," he said. "Yes." I looked at her drawing again, he said. "Last week. First time in 2 years. He paused. "I don't know why I opened it." Nora looked at him steadily. I think you do. He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the first cousin of one, there and gone quickly. Maybe, he said. He picked up his coffee cup, and she picked up hers, and they sat in the kitchen together in the morning light, and the notebook lay on the table between them, like a question neither of them had answered yet, but both of them had stopped pretending wasn't there. That evening was the evening she had been thinking about afterward, when she tried to trace back to where things had changed decisively. It was not dramatic. The most important things rarely were, in her experience. It was only an evening on the front porch, after supper, with the last light going out of the sky in the long, unhurried way it did in open country, and 2 cups of coffee, and the ordinary sounds of a ranch at the end of a day. She had brought the cups out. He had been sitting on the porch already, the way he sometimes was, looking at the distance that he seemed to have a particular relationship with, not avoiding it, not retreating into it, just acknowledging that it was there. She set his cup beside him and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet in the way they had gotten good at, the silence that had changed its quality over the weeks, from careful to comfortable. What do you want? She asked eventually. She kept her voice level, conversational. Not a challenge. An actual question. He looked at her. Not about Crane, she said. Not about the hearing or the ranch or any of that. Just, what do you want? For yourself. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, that the question might be one that required more trust than they had yet accumulated. But then he said, looking back out at the distance, I want to stop waking up every morning and doing the arithmetic. She waited. There's arithmetic I do, he said, every morning, before I'm fully awake, going through the things that happened and the things that didn't and whether they add up differently than they did the day before. He paused. They never do. But I keep doing it. She understood this completely. She had her own arithmetic. She did not say so yet. I want to stop, he said simply. I want to get up in the morning and just be on this ranch, without the weight of the calculation. The last light left the sky and the stars began, quietly, in the way they always did, as if they had been waiting just out of sight for the light to clear. I think, Nora said carefully, that the arithmetic doesn't stop because you decide to stop doing it. I think it stops because something eventually makes the calculation come out different. He looked at her. Not because the facts change, she said. The facts don't change, but because something comes in alongside them that the arithmetic hasn't accounted for. And gradually, she paused, finding the honest version of this. Gradually, the new thing starts to have weight too, and the balance shifts, not to the other side, just, she considered, just to somewhere that isn't only the one thing. He was watching her in the dark with those gray-green eyes that she had learned, over the weeks, to read a little better than she had at the beginning. She saw in them now not the guarded neutrality of the first days, but something that was looking at her with a recognition that went past the surface level. The recognition of someone who has heard, in what another person says, the echo of something they had not found words for themselves. What was his name? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Daniel, she said. He nodded. He did not say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. She had heard she was sorry more times in the past year than she could count, and most of them had been ways of ending conversations rather than continuing them. Ellen, he said. Just the name. Not a story, not an explanation. Just setting it down between them. The way you set down something you have been carrying. Nora looked at the stars. She designed a good stable, she said. The corner of his mouth moved again, more than last time. She designed everything, he said. She couldn't look at a thing without thinking about how it could be better. Used to drive her father half mad. He'd make a decision and she'd have 17 thoughts about how it could be reconsidered. A pause, and in the pause she heard something that was not quite loss. More like the memory of warmth, which is different, which is something you can hold without burning your hands. She was usually right. The eastern light on the stalls, Nora said. I thought that was right. He looked at her. It is, he said. They sat a while longer, until the coffee was gone and the night had settled in fully around them, and the coyotes were talking to each other somewhere out beyond the tree line, and the ranch breathed in the dark, steady and patient, the way it always did. When she stood to go in, he said, Nora. It was the first time he had used her name, not Mrs. Hale, her name. She stopped. The hearing, he said. Whatever Crane brings to it, I intend to be there. She turned and looked at him. He was still looking at the dark, but his jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as decision rather than stubbornness. The way of a man who has finished the argument with himself and arrived somewhere. That will cause problems for you, she said again. Yes, he said, I expect it will. She held his gaze for a moment in the dark. Then she went inside, and she lay in the dark of her room, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about names, about how long it had been since someone had said hers, in a voice that was not accusation or pity or the performed neutrality of someone managing a difficult situation. He had said it plainly. The way you say the name of something that is real. She lay still and let that settle into her the way warmth settles into cold ground in early spring. Slowly, not all at once, but unmistakably. The kind of warmth that, once it begins, does not easily go back the other way. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the night wind, and the stars were very bright, and the ranch held them both in the dark, separate and close, two people who had been carrying arithmetic for too long and were only beginning, carefully, to set some of it down. The notice arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a rider who did not dismount and did not wait for a response. It was brief and formal in the way that documents designed to cause damage often are. The language of procedure wrapped around the substance of threat. The hearing was set for the following Monday. It would be held in the meeting hall above the feed store, which was the largest indoor space the town had available, and which, the notice implied without stating, was expected to be needed at full capacity. Those with testimony to offer were invited to present themselves. Reverend Crane's name appeared at the bottom as the petitioning party, his signature the same practiced, deliberate mark she had seen on the original document. Nora read it twice at the kitchen table, and then set it down and looked at the window and the ordinary morning beyond it, the light moving across the yard the way it always did, indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening inside the house. She had known it was coming. She had known it since the first document arrived, and in some deeper way, she had known it since the note had appeared under her door on that first night, warning her that the town would find its way to her past before long. She had thought she was prepared for it. She found now, with the notice in front of her, that preparation and readiness were not the same thing. Garrett came in from the morning rounds and saw her face and saw the notice and said nothing, which was the right thing. He poured his coffee and sat across from her and read the document she pushed toward him and was quiet for a moment. Monday, he said. Yes. He set the paper down and looked at it with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. That's 5 days. Yes. Outside, Bade was crossing the yard toward the barn, unhurried, his particular gait that was always slightly economical, as if he had learned long ago not to spend movement he didn't need to spend. She watched him through the window and thought about how quickly 5 days could become one, and then none. She found Garrett that evening on the porch, and she said what she had been building herself to say for most of the day. I should leave before Monday. He looked at her. He did not say anything. If the hearing happens, she said, keeping her voice level the way she kept most things level, it becomes a public record. Whatever Crane's witness says, whatever characterization gets put into the official account, that follows the proceedings. It follows you. The ranch. She paused. Crane knows that. That's why he chose a public hearing rather than something quieter. He wants it on record. He wants the association. Garrett's jaw was set. You didn't do anything wrong. That's not what I'm saying. She turned to look at him directly. I'm saying it doesn't matter what I did or didn't do. What matters is what gets said in that room and what gets written down and what people in this town decide to believe about the man who brought me here. She held his gaze. You didn't ask for this. The terms of the arrangement were clear and none of them included this. The arrangement, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was neither anger nor dismissal, but something more specific. A careful, deliberate refusal of the framing. Garrett, you didn't ask for it either, he said. What happened to you before you came here? That wasn't part of any arrangement either. She was quiet. You've been managing this on your own for over a year, he said. Before you got here, and since, doing the practical thing, the quiet thing, the thing that costs you the least visible trouble. He paused. I'm not going to stand in the yard and watch you pack your bag and drive away because Silas Crane decided you're a useful tool. She looked at him for a long moment. The evening was settling around them, the light going the color of old brass, the cottonwoods dark against it. You could lose the ranch, she said. If this goes badly enough, if Crane gets enough of the council behind him, if the social weight of it becomes sufficient, you could lose the ability to operate here. The suppliers, the buyers, I know, he said. I know what I could lose. The silence that followed had a particular quality, not the comfortable silence they had arrived at over the past weeks, but a different kind, denser, weighted with everything that was not being said directly. I'm not, she said carefully, saying I want to leave. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly. The way something shifts when a door that has been held closed by effort is allowed finally to open just a fraction. Then don't, he said. She held his gaze. He held hers. And then she turned and went back into the house, because if she stayed another moment, she was not certain she could maintain the levelness that was her primary defense against everything, and she needed that defense intact for what was coming. He was gone before she woke on Thursday. She came into the kitchen in the early gray light and found Bade at the stove, which was unusual enough to stop her in the doorway. He turned when he heard her, and his expression had the particular quality she had come to read as information being withheld for a reason. Where is he? She asked. Bade poured her coffee and set it on the table. He sat down across from her with his own cup, which meant he intended to stay for a conversation rather than deliver a message and leave. He went to find someone, Bade said. She waited. There was a woman, Bade said slowly, in the manner of a man choosing his words with care. who served as midwife in the town you came from. He found her name in some letters, old ones. He paused. Ellen used to write to people. She was a correspondent, kept up with women in other towns, women who did the kind of work she thought mattered. Midwives, healers, women who managed things that didn't get managed otherwise. He looked at Nora steadily. She'd written to a woman named Millicent Howe, who, as it turns out, lives in a settlement about a day and a half's ride from here, who, as it also turns out, was present in the town you came from on the night your husband died, because she traveled in those days, because that was her work. Nora set her coffee cup down. He's gone to find her, Bade said. He left before first light. He didn't tell you because he didn't know if he could get there and back before Monday, and he didn't want to. Bade paused. He said, I don't want to give her something to hope for if I can't deliver it. The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window, the yard was lightening, the sky going from gray to the pale, luminous white of early morning. A bird said something brief and precise in the cottonwoods. Nora sat with that for a long moment. She thought about the letters in the chest, the ones she had not read, the years of correspondence between a woman who had died and another woman she had never met. She thought about the specific fact that Garrett had read those letters, had read them recently because he had been in the chest recently, and had found in them something he had then ridden out before dawn to pursue. She thought about what it meant that he had not told her, that he had decided the possibility of failure was not something she should have to hold alongside her own fear. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hands were steady. She was good at steady. But something behind her sternum was not entirely steady, and she sat with that too, because she was learning, slowly, that not everything needed to be leveled out. Friday came and went without word. Saturday morning arrived with the particular silence of waiting. Nora managed the ranch with the same efficiency she brought to everything. She made bread. She tended the garden. She treated a small cut on Percy's forearm that he had gotten on a fence post and had been ignoring in the specific way of young men who associate medical attention with weakness. She reorganized the supply cabinet in the barn for the second time because it had been partially undone by someone who had needed something in a hurry and had not restored the order she had established. She did these things and she was present for all of them, her hands doing the work her mind was supposed to be doing, while the rest of her waited. On Saturday afternoon, she went to her room and she opened her bag, the canvas bag she had arrived with, worn soft at the handles, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she began, slowly and methodically, to pack it. She did not know exactly why she was doing it. She told herself it was practical, that whatever happened Monday, having her things ready was simply being prepared. But she was honest enough with herself. In the quiet of the room, with the eastern light through the new curtains, to acknowledge that packing the bag meant something else as well. That it was also the physical gesture of a woman who had learned to be ready to leave, because leaving had been the option that life had repeatedly prepared for her, and some habits were deeper than intention. She packed the bag. She set it at the foot of the bed. She looked at the medical notebook on the table and the smaller notebook beside it, and after a moment, she took both of them and put them in the bag too. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and felt, with a precision she was not accustomed to allowing, how much she did not want to leave. Bade found her in the kitchen after supper. He sat down and looked at her in the way he had when he had something to say. "He's not back," she said. "No." She looked at her hands on the table. "The hearing is Monday morning." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've packed my bag," she said. "I think, after the hearing, whatever the outcome, it might be better if I—" "Don't," Bade said. She looked at him. "Don't decide tonight," he said. He was looking at her with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who has watched many things unfold and has learned that most decisions made in the middle of the night or the middle of fear are not the best versions of themselves. "Wait until Monday. See what happens." "But—" She held his gaze. "And if he doesn't come back in time, then you walk into that room and you say what's true," Bade said. "You've done harder things than that." She thought about what harder things she had done. She thought about 4 hours in a room with a dying man, making decisions with no backup and no certainty, and no one to tell her she was doing it right. She thought about the 14 months after that, moving through a world that had decided what the story was and was not interested in revision. She thought about walking into a room full of people and telling the truth without anyone standing beside her. She had done it before. She was still here. "All right," she said. Sunday came and went in a silence that had weight to it. Monday morning arrived the way significant mornings often did. Unremarkably, the light the same as any other light, the birds saying what they always said, the ranch making its ordinary sounds. Nora woke early and dressed carefully, not for effect, but because careful dressing was what she did when she needed to feel like herself. She made breakfast. She ate it standing at the counter, which was not what she usually did, but which felt right for this particular morning. Bade drove her into town in the small wagon. He did not try to fill the journey with words, which was one of the things she valued about him. The road was straight and the sky was pale, and the distance between the ranch and the town passed in the particular suspension of time that comes before difficult things. The meeting hall above the feed store was, as the notice had implied, well attended. She could see it as they pulled up. Horses at the hitching posts, people moving toward the staircase at the side of the building. The specific atmosphere of a gathering that believes itself to be about justice and is mostly about spectacle. Crane was already there when she entered, standing near the front of the room with 2 other men she recognized from the council. He looked at her when she came in with an expression of pleasant composure that had the quality of a man who believes he has already won and is waiting for the formality to confirm it. Nora found a seat and sat in it with her back straight and her hands in her lap and her expression giving nothing away. Bade sat beside her. The room filled around them. The proceedings were opened by the senior council member, a heavy-set man named Abernathy, who had the look of someone who would rather be doing nearly anything else but understood the political geography of the situation, and had positioned himself accordingly. He laid out the purpose of the hearing in careful, neutral language that managed to convey, through its very neutrality, whose account he expected to prevail. Crane spoke first. He was good at this. She had understood from the beginning that he was good at this, that 30 years of standing at the front of rooms had given him a particular fluency in the language of public persuasion. He did not accuse directly. He raised questions. He expressed concern. He talked about the welfare of the community and the importance of ensuring that those who provided care to the vulnerable were held to appropriate standards of accountability. He mentioned her husband. He mentioned the circumstances. He described, in careful euphemism, what his witness would attest to. The witness was, as she had determined, her husband's cousin, a man named Aldous Fenn, whom she had not seen in over a year, whose face she recognized across the room with the specific feeling of seeing someone who has done you a particular kind of wrong. He was sworn in, and he spoke for some minutes about what he claimed to have seen and understood and been told, and she listened to it with the same careful attention she gave to everything, noting where the facts were accurate and where they were shaped and where the shaping was doing the most work. When Fen finished, Abernathy turned to her and asked if she wished to respond. She stood. She had not prepared remarks in the formal sense. She had thought about what she wanted to say, and she had decided that the only version of this she was capable of delivering, the only version that would not cost her the composure she needed, was the plain one, the one without performance or petition, the one that simply described what had happened and trusted that the truth had enough weight to stand on its own. She told it, the same way she had told Garrett in the barn, in the late afternoon light, with the roan horse watching them. The same facts, the same sequence, the same unflinching account of what she had done and what she had not been able to do and why. She spoke clearly and without rushing, and she did not look at Fen while she spoke, and she did not look at Crane. She looked at the room, at the collection of faces that ranged from skeptical to uncertain to something that might, in different circumstances, become open. And she told the truth. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the door at the back of the hall opened. She heard it before she turned. Heard the particular quality of the sound. Not the polite entry of a latecomer, but the purposeful, unhurried movement of someone who has traveled a long distance and arrived with something to say. Garrett Voss came through the door. He was road dusty, his coat dark with the evidence of hard travel, and his face had the particular look of a man running on the far side of his reserves. But his gaze was clear, and his step was steady. He came down the center aisle of the room, and he did not look at Crane, and he did not look at Abernathy. He looked at Nora for just a moment, a look that communicated precisely what needed to be communicated in the available space. And then he stepped to one side. Behind him, making her way through the door with the careful deliberateness of a woman in her later years, who had nonetheless covered a day and a half of ground with the intention of being precisely here at precisely this moment, was Millicent Howe. She was perhaps 65, small and upright, with white hair and the face of someone who had seen a great deal and had decided to do what she could about most of it. She carried a traveling bag in a manner that occupied the room without effort, the way certain people do, not through dominance, but through the simple confidence of someone who knows what they know and is not afraid to account for it. Abernathy blinked. "And you are Millicent Howe," she said, in a voice that was dry and clear and carried without being raised. "I served as midwife and general practitioner's assistant in the town where Mrs. Hale resided at the time of her husband's death. I was present on the night in question. I have been asked to offer testimony, and I am prepared to do so." Crane's composure did not break, but something shifted in it, a fractional adjustment, like a man who has been watching a game proceed according to his predictions and has just noted an unexpected move. "You were present," Abernathy said carefully. "I arrived approximately 40 minutes before Mr. Hale died," Mrs. Howe said. "The roads were flooding and my passage was delayed considerably. What I found when I arrived was a woman who had been managing a critical medical situation alone for nearly 4 hours, and had done so with the competence and the steadiness of someone with twice her experience." She paused, and the pause had the quality of someone allowing a thing to settle before adding to it. "I have spent 40 years in this work. I have seen capable people, and I have seen the other kind. And I know the difference between them. What Mrs. Hale did that night was not negligence. It was exceptional care, delivered under impossible circumstances. She looked at Crane when she said the last sentence, not at Abernathy, at Crane. The room was very quiet. Aldous Fenn made one attempt to speak, to clarify, to add something, and Abernathy raised a hand that stopped him, with the expression of a man who has just recalibrated the political geography of the situation and found it different from what he had assumed coming in. The questions that followed were careful and thorough, and Mrs. Howe answered each of them in the same dry, clear voice, without embellishment and without hesitation. The way you answer questions when you were there and you remember it, and you are not afraid of what the memory contains. When it was done, when Abernathy had consulted with the other council members in a murmured conversation that lasted perhaps 3 minutes, the decision was delivered in the same careful, neutral language as the opening. The charges, such as they were, not substantiated by the testimony heard. The petition accordingly declined. Crane said nothing. He stood at the front of the room with his pleasant composure intact, and she could not read, from his face, whether he was already calculating his next move or simply absorbing a setback he had not anticipated. Probably both. Men like Crane were usually doing both at once. Nora stood. Her hands were steady. She was aware of Bade rising beside her, of the room beginning to shift and separate into the ordinary movement of people departing. She was aware of Garrett near the back wall, watching her with the expression of a man who has just done something very difficult and is waiting to understand what it cost him. She walked toward him. He stayed where he was and let her come, because he was still and she was moving, and that was how it had worked between them from the beginning. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his face. The road dust and the exhaustion, and underneath both of those things, something that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The face of a man who has made a decision and seen it through, and is now standing in the aftermath of his own choice. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. I thought you left." Something moved through his expression. "I know," he said again. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You look terrible." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've had better mornings." Behind her, she heard Mrs. Howe's voice, Bade introducing himself, the particular ease of two older people finding the frequency of each other quickly. Around them, the room was emptying. Crane had already gone, which meant he was already somewhere planning, and she would need to think about that, but not right now. Right now, there was only this. "The wagon is outside," she said. "Yes." "You need to eat something." "Probably." She turned and began walking toward the door. After a moment, she heard his footsteps behind her. Steady, unhurried. The sound of a man who was going where she was going. She did not look back. She did not need to. Outside, the morning light was full and clear, and the street was ordinary. The way streets are ordinary after extraordinary things, indifferent to what has just shifted in the rooms above them. Bade and Mrs. Howe were already on the steps, deep in what appeared to be a productive conversation. The wagon was where they had left it. Nora stood in the light for a moment, her bag still on her shoulder, the one she had packed with the particular efficiency of someone ready to leave. She unslung it from her shoulder. She set it in the wagon bed. She would unpack it when she got back to the ranch, carefully, the way she had packed it. Each thing returned to its place. The brown-covered notebook back on the table beside the herbs, the worn coat back on the hook beside the door. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Garrett climbed up the other side. Bade helped Mrs. Howe up to the back with a courtesy that suited both of them and the wagon settled under the weight of all of them together, and Garrett gathered the reins, and they started for home. The road was straight and pale, and the sky was the deep, clear blue that comes after tension breaks, and no one said very much, which was right. Some things didn't need words immediately. Some things needed the road and the air and the particular quality of light on open country, and the time it took to get from one place to another before they could be talked about properly. But somewhere between the town and the ranch, Garrett reached across the space between them on the seat, and his hand settled briefly over hers where it rested on the wood beside her. Not holding, just there, present, making contact for the length of a breath before he returned it to the reins. She did not look at him. She looked at the road ahead, but she turned her hand, very slightly, palm up, before he moved it away. He noticed. She knew he noticed. That was enough, for now. That was more than enough. The grain store was still standing when they got back. That was the first thing Nora saw when the wagon came through the cottonwoods and the ranch opened up before them. She saw it and registered it, and then registered, in the same moment, the smell. Faint but unmistakable, the particular sharpness of char beneath the ordinary smells of earth and grass and horse. She looked at Garrett. He had already seen it. The eastern wall of the grain store had burned. Not completely. Something, rain perhaps, or simple fortune, had limited the damage to one section. But the scorching was visible from the wagon, a dark stain against the weathered wood, and the ground around the base was dark with ash and the evidence of where fire had been and had been stopped. Percy was waiting in the yard, looking younger than usual and less certain, which on Percy meant something had genuinely frightened him. He started talking before they had fully stopped. Someone had come in the night, he said, or in the early hours before dawn. He hadn't heard it until the smell woke him, and by the time he got there, it had already caught. But the wind changed and the rain came, and he'd thrown every bucket of water he could manage, and it had stopped short of the main storage. Garrett listened to all of it without interrupting. His face was the controlled face he wore when he was deciding things, and when Percy finished, Garrett said, "You did well," in a tone that was brief and meant exactly what it said, and Percy's shoulders came down about an inch. Nora climbed down from the wagon and walked to the damaged wall. She looked at it for a long moment. The scorching, the specific pattern of where the fire had taken hold and where it had been stopped. She looked at the ground, at the dark area near the base, at the marks in the earth that had not been made by rain or wind. Garrett came to stand beside her. He didn't wait to see how the hearing went, she said. No, he assumed it would go his way and move to the next step, or he wanted to make a point regardless. Garrett looked at the wall. Either way, she turned and looked at him directly. He's not going to stop. No, Garrett said. He's not. They stood in front of the damaged wall in the clear morning light, and she thought about pattern, about what the third thing declares, about men who have done this before and been stopped by nothing, and have therefore concluded they will be stopped by nothing again. She thought about the Fenwick family, about the land sold at 1/4 of its value, about departure as the path of least resistance that Crane had learned to create. "I'm not leaving," she said, not to Garrett specifically, to the damaged wall, to the morning, to the specific question that had been asked of her in various forms since the day she arrived. "I know," Garrett said. Mrs. Howe stayed 3 days. She slept in the guest room at the end of the hall, and she was up before anyone each morning, which Nora respected, and she had opinions about the kitchen organization that she expressed once and then let go of when Nora declined to change it, which Nora respected even more. On the second evening, after supper, Mrs. Howe asked Garrett if she could speak with him privately. Nora went to the kitchen and washed dishes and did not listen, because some things were not hers to hear until they were offered to her. He came to find her afterward, when the house was quiet. He stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the guarded neutrality of the early weeks, not the deliberate openness she had watched him learn, but something else. Something that had been set down and was still in the process of settling. "She gave me a letter," he said. Nora turned from the window where she had been watching the dark yard. He held it, a folded piece of paper, older, the creases soft with age, the kind of letter that had been kept rather than discarded, which meant it had been kept deliberately. "Ellen wrote to her," he said. "Toward the end. Mrs. Howe kept it." He paused. "She thought I should have it." Nora waited. "I haven't read it yet," he said, with the particular care he used when he was saying something that cost him something. "I wanted to tell you it existed before I read it. I don't know why. It seemed important that you know." She looked at him in the lamplight, this man who had ridden a day and a half each way on a possibility, who had arrived road-dusted and running on reserves and had not asked for acknowledgement of any of it, who was standing in her kitchen holding a letter from his dead wife and telling her about it before he had read it, because something in him had decided that was the honest order of things. "Go read it," she said gently. "Take your time." He nodded. He went. She finished the dishes and banked the stove and sat at the kitchen table with her smaller notebook open in front of her, though she did not write in it. She sat with the lamp and the quiet of the house and waited, not impatiently, in the way she had learned to wait for things that mattered. He came back after a long while. He sat across from her and set the letter on the table between them, folded along its original creases, and he looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "She wrote, 'If I don't make it through this, I hope he finds someone with enough courage to stay.'" The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp flame held still because there was no draft. Nora looked at the letter on the table. She thought about a woman she had never met, sitting down to write in what she understood might be her last clear-headed days, thinking about the man she was leaving behind, and what she hoped for him. Thinking about courage, about staying. "She knew you well," Nora said. "She did." His voice was low. "Better than I knew myself, usually." A silence settled, but it was not an empty silence. It was the kind that comes after something has been set down. The particular quiet of weight that has been carried a long way, finally finding a place to rest. "She would have liked you," he said. Nora looked at him. "You said that before. In a different way. I mean it more now." He held her gaze. "She didn't like people who pretended. She didn't have patience for it. She said it was the one thing she couldn't work with. Someone who was performing instead of being." He paused. "You don't perform." "No," Nora said. "It takes too much energy." Something moved through his expression. That near smile she had learned to look for. Brief and real. There and gone. In the morning, Mrs. Howe came to find Nora in the kitchen garden, where Nora was assessing what the season had left and what would need to be put up before the cold came. The older woman walked the rows with her for a while in a comfortable silence before she spoke. "He's a good man," she said. "Stubborn in the way good men often are. Takes him longer than it should to understand what he needs." She paused. "But he understands it eventually." Nora kept her hands in the soil. "He rode a day and a half to find you." "Yes." Mrs. Howe was quiet for a moment. "Ellen would have done the same for him." that kind of instinct. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from what you've watched and what you've learned and what you decide to become. She looked at Nora. You have it too, in case you haven't noticed. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the garden and did not say anything, because she did not have a response that was not too large for the morning. Mrs. Howe left after the midday meal, Bade driving her to meet the supply wagon that would carry her back toward home. She shook Nora's hand at the gate with a grip that was brief and firm and said nothing sentimental, which was the right goodbye for who she was. She said something quietly to Garrett that Nora did not hear, and he nodded once, and then she was gone, and the yard was ordinary again. Crane's further attempts arrived in the weeks after, forwarded from those with greater reach than the local council, and found nothing to hold on to. The hearing's outcome had been recorded. Mrs. Howe's testimony was documented. The pattern that Bade and 2 other families had laid out, carefully and with specificity, had been received by those whose responsibility it was to receive such things. Crane did not lose everything at once. Men like Crane rarely did. But he lost the council seat within the month, and with it the particular leverage that had made him formidable, and the land acquisitions he had been maneuvering toward quietly collapsed without his influence behind them. The ranch did not change immediately. It was still the same work, the same land, the same mornings and evenings. But the quality of the days was different, lighter in some way that was difficult to name precisely, but that everyone on the ranch seemed to feel, the way you feel a change in weather before you can point to what has changed. On a morning in the middle of that season, Garrett came to find Nora and said simply, "Come with me." And she came. He led her to the south side of the barn, where the ground was level and the eastern light fell long and clear in the mornings. And he showed her the stakes he had driven into the earth, 4 corners, measured carefully, in a configuration she recognized immediately. The stable. Ellen's stable. The dimensions were the ones from the drawing, the orientation the one she had noted in her own margins, positioned to catch the morning light in the stalls, exactly as the notes had suggested. She looked at the stakes in the ground. She looked at him. "I'd need help with the design," he said. "There are measurements I want to check, notes I want to revisit." He paused. "If you still have the notebook." "I still have the notebook," she said. He nodded. He looked at the 4 stakes and the space they defined, and she could see in his face both what this was and what it had been. The drawing in the tin, the years of it sitting there, the morning he had opened the chest, and the evening after the hearing, and the letter that had said, "Courage, staying." "It's a good design," he said. "She was a precise thinker," Nora said. "She was." He was quiet for a moment. "I think she would have wanted it built." Nora looked at the stakes, at the ground that would become something, at the eastern light falling across it. "Then we should build it," she said. That evening Garrett came to the kitchen after supper and stood at the counter while she was putting things away. And she was aware of him standing there with the quality of attention that meant he had come to say something and was finding his way to it. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned, over the weeks and months, that some things needed the space of their own time, and that patience was not passivity, but its own kind of care. He reached into his coat pocket. He held out his hand, palm up, and on it was the pocket watch, the one with the cracked crystal that she had seen him carry every day since she arrived, that he put on in the morning and took off at night, that he had carried through the long ride to find Mrs. Howe and through the hearing, and through every morning's quiet arithmetic. He held it out to her, not as a gift exactly, as something more specific than a gift, as a thing being placed somewhere it could be still. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it from his hand, carefully, and turned it over once, the cracked crystal catching the lamplight. She set it on the windowsill above the basin, where the morning light would find it first, between the jar of dried herbs and the edge of the curtain. She looked at it sitting there. He looked at it too. Then she turned back to the shelves, and he stayed where he was, and they were in the kitchen together in the lamplight, and outside the cottonwoods moved in the evening wind, and the ranch settled into night around them the way it always had, patient and steady and old in its bones, holding them both without preference or condition, the way good land holds whatever is given time to take root. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said in the gesture, in the watch on the windowsill, in the stakes in the ground that would become something built. She turned down the lamp. He held the kitchen door for her as she passed. The screen closed behind them both with the sound of something ordinary, which was, after everything, exactly what she had been looking for all along. Not rescue, not resolution in the dramatic sense, just the ordinary evening of a place that had become, without her entirely deciding it had, home. And the man standing in it, doing the same quiet arithmetic she was, not counting losses anymore, but something else. Something that did not yet have a name, but that was, unmistakably, beginning.